Welcome back everybody to part 2 of this series on Herodotus of Halicarnassus, following him book by book as he makes his way through the history of Greece and Persia. Today we're going to be looking at book 2, Herodotus's description of Egypt. If you haven't seen part 1 of the series yet, it's worth a watch. Seriously, it's good stuff. But if you can't be bothered or if you've forgotten, here's a quick recap. In Book 1, we learned about the rise of the Persian Empire under its first king, Cyrus the Great, who conquered the kingdoms of Media, Lydia, and Babylonia. We also learned that in Herodotus's history, great emphasis is put on prophecy, oracle, and fate. We also learned about Herodotus's character archetypes. Herodotus considers the personalities of kings, rulers, and generals to be incredibly important, and most of them fall into one of these categories. We finished last week with the death of Persia's first and greatest king, Cyrus, the man who overreached and ended up being killed in battle by a warrior queen. This week we'll get into what comes next. So, as I've already mentioned, Herodotus is famous for his massive and pretty jarring digressions. One of the reasons that he can be quite difficult to read for a modern audience is he holds many narrative threads together at the same time, all interlocking with each other, and he's not really all that clear on them. He expects us to pay attention and keep track of everything. Herodotus's digressions have their own digressions, and his narrative is constantly being interrupted by these long and often seemingly barely relevant tangents. Book 2 is Herodotus's biggest digression. The whole book is dedicated entirely to describing the country of Egypt. That's it. It's just a description of Egypt. In my copy of Herodotus right here, it's just 75 pages of describing what Egypt's like. And to a modern audience, this feels pretty out of place. Like a chapter from a different book got lost and accidentally wandered into this one. And that might be true. Some scholars believe that Book 2 was never intended to be a part of the histories, that it was actually part of a completely different work that Herodotus was, trying to write, but it ended up getting lumped in for some reason or another. I think the reason is probably because Book 3, what comes after this, starts with Cyrus's son, Cambyses, the new king of Persia, conquering Egypt. And as we will see in the next part of this video, Egypt consumes Cambyses. And so it's fair that Herodotus wants to give us quite a bit of backstory on what this country of Egypt is actually like. Egypt at this point of history is already an ancient society. The pyramids are over 2,000 years old by the time Herodotus visits them, and he seems to have been very impressed by Egypt. He travelled all up and down the country, and he speaks very highly of Egypt and the Egyptians. But that doesn't mean he understood them. One of my favourite bits of Book 2 is when Herodotus visits the Great Pyramids, and he beholds them and he's very impressed. And when he goes up for a closer look, he spots some hieroglyphs carved into the side. And he turns to his Egyptian translator and he asks what the hieroglyphs say. And the translator says, this is the rations for the workers who built the pyramids. How many radishes, how many onions, how much they get for their lunch break. Now this is obviously nonsense. We can be pretty certain that when the Old Kingdom pharaohs were constructing these mighty tombs designed to last for eternity, they didn't scribble their shopping list on the side of them. We don't know what Herodotus's translator meant by this, but my favourite explanation is that he was just a rubbish tour guide or a bit of a scam artist. One of those dodgy tour operators who makes things up to fool unsuspecting tourists. Tour guides do that kind of stuff all the time today. What's to say that they weren't doing that in the ancient world as well? And this is something to always bear in mind when we read Herodotus. His method is interview. That's how he does his research. That's how he gathers his information. But he doesn't always tell us who he's interviewing, and some of his sources are pretty disreputable. Herodotus doesn't seem to be that good at vetting his interviewees. This is especially true of things like his description of the city of Babylon, which is in Book 1. I sort of skipped over that in the last part. But there is a lot of debate amongst modern scholars about whether or not Herodotus even visited the region. His description of the city doesn't fit with our archaeological understanding of Babylon, and his portrayal of Babylonian culture, most famously the wife auctions that inspired this famous painting here, is pretty inconsistent with our understanding of how the Babylonians actually operated. Herodotus relies occasionally on sources that are unreliable or misinformed, and he himself is pretty prone to a bit of misunderstanding. I mean, you got to remember that he is a Greek travelling in a non-Greek world, and it doesn't seem that he understands the local language and doesn't really have an intimate understanding of the people that he's dealing with quite a lot of the time. He sees everything through a Greek lens. A good example of this is how Herodotus describes gods. When he's in Egypt, he speaks to what he calls the priests of Hephaestus in Memphis, and this may strike Egyptologists amongst you as being a little odd. There are no priests of Hephaestus in Egypt. Hephaestus is a Greek god, not an Egyptian one. Well, what Herodotus means is the priests of Ptah, the Egyptian god of crafting and creation. Herodotus does this all the time. Whenever he encounters a foreign deity, he finds the most fitting Greek equivalent and refers to it as such. So ruling deities like Marduk in Babylon, Amun in Egypt, or Ahura Mazda in Persia are always referred to as Zeus. Solar deities like the Egyptian Ra are called Apollo, and goddesses of love or fertility or childbirth like Ishtar or Aeltetat, the Arabian one, you know which one I mean, are referred to as Aphrodite. Sometimes this fits quite well, but other times it can be misleading. For example, the Persian supreme deity, Ahura Mazda, is absolutely nothing like Greek Zeus, and you wouldn't know that from reading Herodotus. This is one of the ways where he can be quite tricky, because even though Herodotus is a very curious and open-minded guy, he is still a 2,500-year-old Greek man who, like all people throughout all of history, struggles to see the world through any lens other than his own. Anyways, back to the text. Herodotus lovingly describes the country of Egypt. He clearly had a fantastic time there. He talks about the mighty Nile River, which he calls the gift, because it floods reliably and keeps the land fertile. He talks about the mighty mountain range that borders the Red Sea, which he spent 2 months traversing. And he talks about the famous black sands of Egypt, from which the country probably gets its name. He also describes, for his Greek audience, the diverse and exotic wildlife of this strange country. Crocodiles, for example, which must have been a terrifying concept for the folks back home. These giant river lizards that sometimes eat people. But Herodotus says that although the crocodiles are mighty predators that could eat any animal they wanted, they're also clever. They form alliances with the local birds. They'll crawl out of the river, open their mouths, and allow the birds to clean their teeth. He also mentions that some Egyptians consider crocodiles to be sacred animals, and that they keep them in captivity and mummify them after death. Which is true. You can go to Komombo in Egypt today and see the mummified remains of Nile crocodiles. Herodotus loves this kind of stuff. You know, he was an endlessly curious guy. That's why I love him, even when he's wrong. And, you know, he was capable of some pretty good scientific thinking, given the resources at his disposal. For example, Herodotus wants to know why the Nile River floods reliably every year. Simple question, you might think, but as Herodotus points out, it hardly ever rains in Egypt. So where is all this water coming from? Herodotus gives us 3 theories as to why the Nile floods the way that it does, posited by other Greeks. One of which is that the northern shore of Egypt is bombarded by strong southerly winds, and whilst the Nile is flowing northwards, these winds are pushing water southwards, and this causes the Nile to back up with water and overflow and burst its banks. But Herodotus spots that this is obviously nonsense. To start with, there are many rivers around the world that flow in the opposite direction to the wind, and they don't act the same way. And also, he's been to Egypt, and he can see that the Nile floods whether there are strong winds or not. So it can't be this. Some other Greeks will tell you that the Nile floods because the entire earth is surrounded by a great ocean, which feeds into southern Africa. But Herodotus says that this ocean that circumvents the earth is nonsense. It's a fiction, invented by some imaginative Greek poets. The third theory is Herodotus's least favourite one. Some Greeks claim that the further south into Africa you go, the colder it gets, until eventually it is snow and ice. And when this ice melts, it feeds into the Nile, inundates it, causes it to flood. In the same way that the snows and the ice of the Taurus Mountains in Anatolia feed into the Tigris and Euphrates rivers and cause them to flood. But Herodotus doesn't buy into this at all. Africa, he says, gets hotter the further south you go. Something he knows because A, southerly winds are always warm. B, the people there have darker skin than the people in the north, and Herodotus has observed that in hotter countries, people tend to have darker skin. And C, birds from that region don't migrate. And he says that in the north of Europe, where it's very, very cold, birds migrate all the time, but African birds don't. Using this evidence, Herodotus correctly concludes that Africa is hot. Herodotus then gives us his own theory, a rather complicated one that has something to do with the Earth being like a flat disk, and the sun moves over it in like an arc way, and also the sun and the heavens can be affected by the weather in the same way that like clouds are. And, you know, we really don't have time to get into it, but he's wrong. But the point is, he gave it a bloody good go. Even when Herodotus is wrong, his deductive reasoning is usually fairly sound. He's just often working with, you know, bad or limited information. This is why Herodotus is the father of history. Real history, not just telling stories about what happened in the past, you know, like I do on this channel. No, real, actual history. The method of investigation. That is what separates Herodotus's history from legend. Herodotus also shows off a little bit of his sassy side in Book 2, when he's confronted with a question that many Greeks have. You know, why is it that the Nile has no cool breeze coming off it like other rivers do? He responds with a delightful bit of snark. It is in my opinion hardly surprising that no such breeze blows from places that are warm. A cool breeze tends to blow from somewhere cold. Herodotus clearly loves Egypt. He justifies his massive digression into describing it by saying that it has more wonders that beggar belief than any other country on earth. He also has quite a lot of time for the Egyptians as a people. He calls them the most learned people in the world. Herodotus also gives us some examples of the customs of the Egyptians that may have been of interest to his fellow Greeks. For example, the fact that in Egypt, toilets are built inside the house and people take their meals outdoors. To the Greeks, who had it the opposite way, you eat indoors and the toilet is out in the garden, this would have been a strange curiosity. And it seems that Herodotus is probably right. Some of the earliest indoor toilets ever excavated come from Egypt. He also says that in Egypt, men urinate sat down, whilst women do it standing up. Not sure, I don't really know how that would work. I mean, I have seen women urinate standing up before, but never outside of festivals. Herodotus also points out that Egyptian medicine and Egyptian doctors are some of the best in the world. Egypt is the only country where medical professionals specialise. You get ear doctors, throat doctors, midwives, dentists. If you got sick in the ancient world, there was no better place to be than Egypt. The Egyptians were dedicated to medicine. They called it the necessary art. And this dedication was so intense that it's possible that our word chemistry derives from the word Kemet, the Egyptian word for Egypt. Possibly. I believe that etymology is still kind of disputed. He also describes quite a lot about Egyptian religious life. Not the dogma. Herodotus is never really that interested in that. He's not particularly keen on finding out how people use religion to explain the world. He's more interested in the practices and the ritual. He points out for his Greek audience, who are used to their temples being maintained by both men and women, that in Egypt only men could be priests. And as opposed to in Greece, where priests will grow their hair and beard, like I do, in Egypt they shave their whole head. Like I probably should at this point. Herodotus' fascination with the Egyptian religion may colour the rest of his account of the country. For example, he tells us that in the whole country of Egypt, no one eats beans, which they consider to be an impure food. Which seems a little bit odd because, as well as being a staple of the modern Egyptian diet, we know that even in the ancient times, beans were cultivated in Egypt quite regularly. What might be the case here is that Egyptian priests would abstain from eating beans as part of their religious duty, and Herodotus, who is getting almost all of his information from priests, then made a broad generalization about all Egyptians. And if that is the case, it seems that abstaining from beans was a pretty big part of many religious sects in the ancient Mediterranean. Back in Greece, the Orphics and the Pythagoreans also famously did not eat beans. But you guys don't want to hear about beans. We're in ancient Egypt. We want the good stuff. The stuff Egypt's famous for. We want mummies. And Herodotus does not disappoint. He gives us a lovely, detailed description of the mummification process. When you die as an Egyptian, your family has 3 options, and all of them come with a different price tag. If you've got the big bucks, the money to spend, the most expensive mummification option goes like this. Hook goes up your nose, give it a good whisk round, pull out the brain. Cut open the body, out with the intestines. Shove that torso full of herbs and spices and spray a little bit of perfume in there to cover up the smell. Then leave the body to set for about 70 days, wrap the whole thing in linen, and voila, you have a mummy. The second option avoids cutting you open at all. Instead, a syringe is inserted into the cadaver's rectum, and cedar oil is pumped into the torso. A special butt plug is then inserted to prevent leakage, and the body is left for a few days so that all of the insides can liquefy. They then remove the plug and everything just drains out, and the hollow bag of dried skin and bones is delivered over to the family for burial. Herodotus makes no mention on whether the family can keep the butt plug as a souvenir, or whether or not the embalmers hold on to it for reuse. And the third option, the cheapest, goes like this. They cut you open, they give you a quick scrub down, and then they sew you back up. You really do get what you pay for. There was also a fourth option, reserved for especially attractive women, which was effectively the same as normal mummification, but the process wouldn't begin for about 3 or 4 days. This would give the body time to decompose a little bit and become, kind of gross. This was to dissuade the necrophilic tendencies of the embalmers, which was apparently a problem that was endemic in ancient Egypt. And still is today. I learned this whilst researching for this video. Now you know it too. Herodotus also gives us a brief history of Egypt, using the Kings List, 330 generations of Egyptian kings and 1 queen. Now, this Kings List is a lot of fun, but it's not good history. Herodotus' source for this information seems to be the priests of Memphis, and they probably preserved their country's history through oral tradition. And as a result, it's a really good source for what Egyptians in the 5th century BCE thought about their country's history. Not that good a source for the actual events of the previous 2.5 millennia of Egyptian history. Herodotus gives us the highlights. The best pharaohs with the most fun stories. Here are a couple of my favourites. Herodotus describes the achievements of the great conquering pharaoh Sesostris, the man who marched an army all the way up the Middle East and into Europe, fighting battles and conquering along the way. Whenever he won, he would erect a mighty pillar to symbolise his victory, and to remind everyone that he was the greatest conqueror that ever lived. And this is very cool, but also fictional. Sesostris was not a real pharaoh. He seems to be an amalgamation of different warlike conquering pharaohs that over time the Egyptians combined into this one paragon of ideal kingship. The great monuments, the pillars that Herodotus refers to, are often identified with Hittite structures. Herodotus also tells the story of Pharos, the blind king, the king who lost his sight and was told he would only regain it if he washed his eyes in the urine of a woman who had only ever had sex with her husband. After sampling the urine of several women, including his own wife, none of them worked, and this infuriated Pharos until eventually he found the right woman with the right urine. He washes his eyes, he regains his sight, he burns his unfaithful wife to death, and he marries Piss Girl, and they all live happily ever after. But my personal favourite pharaoh on the king's list is Rhampsinitus. Rhampsinitus was an incredibly wealthy king. He had loads of money, but he was incredibly paranoid that someone was coming to steal it. So he constructed a mighty vault to protect his treasure. But the builder who he hired to make the vault was a clever fellow. He left one stone intentionally loose, and many years later, when his health began to decline and he was on his deathbed, he revealed to his two sons this secret, and he told them that they would be rich if they removed this stone and entered the vault. The two sons take their father's advice. Night after night they go to the vault, they remove the loose stone, they sneak in, and they take little bits of treasure to make it not obvious. But over time, the king notices that his fortune is slowly shrinking. Rhampsinitus' solution is to lay traps in the vault. And one night the two brothers are up to their usual tricks. They've removed the stone, they're stealing the money, and one of them gets his foot caught in the trap. And he very quickly realizes it's all over. And he turns to his brother and he says, "Look, mate, you have to kill me. And when you kill me, behead me so that my body can't be identified and the security of our family isn't jeopardized." The next day, the king goes to his vault and is shocked to find that not only has his fortune decreased in size yet again, but now there is a headless corpse with its foot caught in a trap just kind of lying there. He puts two and two together and he realizes there must have been another thief. So he has a new idea. He decides to take the headless corpse and display it on the city walls and tell the guards to keep an eye out for anyone who looks like they're mourning or sad whenever they see it. At this point, the mother of the one surviving thief decides to intervene. She cannot stand the sight of her son's headless corpse hanging from the walls of the city, and she insists that her remaining child do something about it. And if he doesn't, she will go straight to Pharaoh and tell him everything. So the remaining thief devises a plan to retrieve his brother's body. He fills a wagon full of wine, and he drives it up to the walls where the guards are stationed, guarding the corpse. And when he's going past the guards, he pretends to spill everything. He spills some wine over the side, the cargo falls out of the wagon, it goes everywhere, and he starts cursing, and he's clearly very annoyed, and the guards are having a laugh about this. And he turns to them, he's like, "Well, it's all well and good for you to laugh. This is my livelihood. I'm a wine delivery guy. I'm not going to get paid now." And the guards feel sorry for him, so they go and they help him collect up all of the wine, put it back in his wagon for him. And he's like, "Yeah, I'm sorry I shouted at you there, guys. It's really nice of you to help me out here. Tell you what, why don't I give you some of this wine for free as thanks for your help?" And the guards go, "Well, it's a hot day and we have to stand out here and, guard this headless body. So, yeah, we could go for a cup. And, you seem like a nice guy. It's nice of you to offer us this reward of some free wine. Come and join us for a drink." So the remaining brother is there. He's having a drink with the guards. And before long, he's gotten them thoroughly drunk. And they pass right out. This is his opportunity. He goes to the wall. He cuts down his brother's body and takes it away. But before he leaves, bit of insult to injury, he shaves half the guard's face, so they've only got half a beard left. To really show everyone what silly geese these guards are. The pharaoh is obviously furious at this. He needs to catch this guy now. So he comes up with a new plan. He goes to his daughter, who's an extremely beautiful young woman, and he says, "Daughter, I have a favour to ask from you. I've got this plan, right? But I need you to help. And stick with me here. It's going to sound like a weird plan, but trust me, there's something to it. I need you to go into the town, and I need you to sleep with any man who wants to." And she goes, "Done. Got it, Dad. Well up for that. See you soon." And Pharaoh pauses. He goes, No, wait. There is more to the plan than that. I need you to go into town, offer to sleep with any man who wants to, but on one condition. He tells you the cleverest thing he's ever done. Ah, here's the idea. So the thief is going to show up. He's going to want to sleep with the Pharaoh's daughter. But she's going to ask him, what's the cleverest thing you ever done? And when he tells some story about breaking into a vault or retrieving his brother's corpse from a wall, she's going to grab a hold of him, apprehend him. Pharaoh's soldiers are going to run in. They can arrest him there and then. The remaining thief hears about the princess's offer, and he decides to take her up on it. He can see through the whole plot, by the way. He knows this is a trick by Pharaoh to try and catch him. And he really has nothing to gain here. But this isn't about treasure anymore. It hasn't been about treasure for a long time. This is about proving that he is cleverer than Pharaoh. This is a battle of wits, and he plans to win. The thief's plan is to defile a corpse. He's going to dig up a dead body, cut off the arm, and then pull the old trick of sticking his real arm inside his shirt, fake arm up the sleeve. Then he goes to the temple, finds Pharaoh's daughter, and propositions her. And Pharaoh's daughter says, "Yes, absolutely, I'll sleep with you. But on one condition. You tell me the cleverest thing you've ever done." And the thief spills the beans immediately. He tells her all about the heist, all about how he retrieved his brother's body. And just as her father planned, the princess grabs him by the arm and tries to detain him. But the arm slips seamlessly from his sleeve, and the thief makes his getaway. Pharaoh's daughter is left sitting completely befuddled, holding the decomposing arm of a corpse. Herodotus tells us that after this little episode, Pharaoh was no longer angry. He was far too impressed to be angry. He said that clearly this was a man of great wits, so he pardoned him, he let him keep all of the treasure he'd stolen, and he also married him to his daughter. You know, the girl with the arm. What a phenomenal story. Modern scholars reckon it really genuinely is Egyptian folklore, even if it almost certainly didn't actually happen. I mean, really, does that story sound plausible to any of you guys? Herodotus, as soon as he wraps the tale up, reminds us that he is just repeating what he's heard other people say. It's up to us to decide whether we want to believe it. The King's List really is great fun. I wish I had time to go into it in more detail, talk about more pharaohs. But alas, Book 3 is calling, and the main narrative, the prelude to war and the Persian invasion of Egypt, is coming soon. So we're going to have to get back to the narrative. And to do that, we've got to skip ahead to the last pharaoh of Egypt. In the century or two before Herodotus' day, many Greeks had found themselves emigrating to Egypt. A good many of these were merchants and traders who operated out of cities like Naucratis, Greek trading posts in the north of Egypt. But many, many more were mercenaries and soldiers in the employment of the Egyptian pharaohs. The pharaoh Apries was a big fan of these Greek mercenaries, and he became increasingly reliant on them. But this didn't help him when his main general Amasis rebelled against him. Riding a massive wave of native support, Amasis defeated Apries' Greek mercenaries, killed his predecessor, and crowned himself pharaoh. So this new pharaoh Amasis was a usurper who had seized power, and this caused a bit of an issue for him, because although the Egyptians liked him as a man, most of them didn't seem to respect him as a king. He had been born a commoner, worked his way up through the ranks of the military, and seized power violently, and many Egyptians couldn't shake the feeling that their new god king was really just some bloke. Amasis cured them of this using a metaphor. He found a bowl that was used as a foot bath, you know, for people to wash their feet in, and he had it melted down and turned into a statue of a god. When he walked into the palace the next day, he saw his nobles worshipping this statue. And he said, well, you know what that statue is, right? That was the foot bath. All of you used to wash your feet in that. And you over there, I saw you throw up into it once. And the nobles explained, they said, yes, it was a foot bath, but now it's a statue of the god, and it deserves respect. And Amasis says, the same is true of me. I was once a common man, a regular person, but now I have transformed. I am a pharaoh, and you should respect me the same way. There are two other stories about Amasis that I just love. The first one has to do with the fact that apparently he was a little bit of a sucker for leisure. He would wake up in the morning and spend a few hours until midday, conducting business, doing work. But as soon as the early afternoon set in and he could get away with it, he would dismiss everybody and spend the rest of the day drinking, feasting, and having fun. One day, one of his nobles, had a bit of a go at him over this. They were like, you're king, you should work harder. And Amasis says that a good archer knows when to unstring his bow, for even the strongest bow, if forever strung, loses its strength eventually. Before he became pharaoh, Amasis had a real reputation for unseriousness and as a really heavy drinker, and because he was a poor man, a commoner, he would regularly steal to pay for the next round. He was caught on more than one occasion, and whenever they caught him stealing, they would haul him before the temple, before the gods, for judgment. And sometimes he would be found innocent, sometimes he would be found guilty. When he became pharaoh, he went to all the temples that found him guilty, and he lavishly bestowed gifts on them, whilst the temples that had let him off lightly, he basically ignored. When he was asked about this, he said, well, I was obviously guilty every single time, so any god that let me off was clearly dishonest, and any god that condemned me was clearly an honest and just one. I love it. I really do. That's just fantastic, isn't it? This is why I love ancient history, man. Even if it's kind of mythologized and parts of it probably aren't true, the personalities of these long dead people still manage to shine through. I think it's just wonderful. And with that, we end Herodotus' description of Egypt. Amasis will be the last pharaoh to rule in peace, because in Book 3, we're going to cover the reign of Cambyses and the Persian invasion of Egypt.